Finland, December 1939. Temperatures plummet to 40 degrees below zero. Snow blankets everything like an endless white mantle. And amidst this frozen landscape, one of the most brutal and unequal wars in modern history is about to begin. The Soviet Union, with an army of over 1 million soldiers, modern tanks, fighter jets, and heavy artillery, invades Finland expecting an easy victory in 2 weeks. Stalin wants to expand his empire westward, and this small Nordic country seems like easy prey. After all, Finland has an army of barely 300,000 men, outdated equipment, and virtually no modern tanks or aircraft. The whole world is waiting to see this small nation crushed in a matter of days. Soviet generals are betting bottles of vodka on who will reach Helsinki first. Red Army soldiers are marching toward the border with absolute confidence, some even without enough ammunition because their superiors told them the war would be over before they could fire it all. But Stalin hadn't counted on something. He hadn't counted on the unyielding spirit of a people who would rather die than lose their freedom. He hadn't counted on the Finns' intimate knowledge of their own frozen forests. And he definitely hadn't counted on men like Simo Häyhä. Simo was born in 1905 on a small farm in Rotjärvi near the Russian border. He was the youngest of 8 children. From childhood, his life revolved around 2 things: working the land and hunting in the forests. He wasn't tall, barely 5 feet 3 inches. He wasn't imposing at all. In fact, if you saw him on the street, you probably wouldn't remember him. He was just another Finnish farmer. But there was something special about Simo. From the age of 5, his father taught him to shoot. And they discovered that this little boy had a natural gift. He could hit a coin tossed in the air. He could shoot hares at full speed. By the age of 13, he was already winning local shooting competitions. Not because he had special equipment or professional training, simply because he practiced every day for hours in the woods near his home. When he turned 17, like all young Finns, he had to do his mandatory military service. He was assigned to a light infantry company. His superiors immediately noticed his skill with a rifle, but Simo was humble, quiet, and never boasted. He completed his service and returned to his farm, believing his life would be peaceful, growing potatoes and hunting occasionally. For the next few years, Simo lived the simple life he had envisioned. He rose before dawn, worked his land, hunted to supplement his food, and occasionally participated in shooting competitions where he consistently won first place. On Sundays, he went to church. He was well-liked in his community. A good neighbor. A quiet, hard-working man. But everything changed on November 30th, 1939. That day, Soviet bombs began to fall on Finnish territory. Simo was on his farm when he heard the explosions in the distance. He saw black smoke rising above the horizon. He heard on the radio the news that would change his life. Finland was at war. The next day, Simo walked to the nearest recruitment point. He was 34, no longer young by military standards. But Finland needed every man available. He was assigned to the 6th Regiment of the Jaeger Division, destined to defend the very region where he was born. He knew every tree, every hill, every frozen lake in that area. It was his backyard. They gave him a white winter camouflage uniform and a Mosin-Nagant Model 28-30 rifle. It was an old, heavy weapon, designed decades ago, but Simo wanted nothing more. That specific model was the one he had used all his life for hunting. He knew every peculiarity of the weapon, how it breathed, how it reacted to extreme cold, exactly how much to compensate for wind and distance. The officers offered him a telescopic sight for his rifle. All professional snipers used them. But Simo refused. His reasoning was brilliant. Telescopic sights could fog up in the extreme cold. They could reflect sunlight and give away your position. And they forced you to raise your head higher in the snow, making you more visible. He would use only the basic iron sights as he always had. In the first days of December, Finnish units were sent to establish defensive positions. The strategy was clear. They could not defeat the Soviets in open battle. They were outnumbered 20-1. What they had to do was use the terrain to their advantage, use the lethal cold of the Finnish winter, and make every meter of advance cost so much Soviet blood that eventually Stalin would consider the war not worth it. Simo was assigned as a lone sniper. This meant that, unlike regular soldiers who fought in groups, he would operate alone or with only one observer. His mission was simple but brutal: infiltrate enemy territory or position himself at strategic points and eliminate as many Soviet soldiers as possible, especially officers, radio operators, and other high-value targets. The first few days were spent reconnaissance. Simo spent hours studying enemy movements, memorizing their routines, identifying their patrol routes, and observing where they established their camps. He learned that the Soviets were disciplined but predictable. They moved in rigid formations. Their officers always marched in the same position relative to their troops. They made small mistakes that an experienced hunter could exploit, and then the hunt began. His first victim was a Soviet officer who stepped out of his tent for a cigarette. From 400 meters away, Simo watched him through his iron sights. He waited for the man to stop moving, to be completely still for a second. And then he pulled the trigger. The officer fell instantly. It took the soldiers around him several seconds to even realize what had happened. That was the first day. In the following days, Simo developed a lethal routine. He would wake up before dawn, when the sky was still dark. He would dress completely in white, from his hood to his boots. He would crawl to his chosen position, sometimes taking hours to travel just a few hundred meters, moving so slowly that he was invisible to any observer. Once in position, Simo did something that military manuals didn't teach but that his experience as a hunter had taught him. He meticulously prepared his surroundings. He compacted the snow in front of him until it was as hard as ice, so that when he fired, the rifle wouldn't raise a cloud of white dust that would betray his location. He filled his mouth with snow so that when he breathed, his warm breath wouldn't create visible vapor in the frigid air. Then he would wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days on end, practically motionless, enduring temperatures of 40 degrees below zero. His fingers grew numb inside his gloves. His body trembled involuntarily. But Simo had spent his entire life hunting in these woods. He knew how to enter an almost meditative state, how to make his body consume as little energy as possible, how to remain alert while seemingly frozen. And when he finally saw a target, when a Soviet soldier made the mistake of exposing himself even for a second, Simo would fire. One shot, one kill. He never fired twice from the same position. Immediately after the shot, he was already moving, crawling to his next location while the Soviets frantically fired in the direction they thought he had been. What made Simo truly terrifying wasn't just his marksmanship. It was his discipline. Other snipers would get carried away by the excitement, firing at regular soldiers, quickly racking up kills. Simo was more patient, more strategic. He would wait hours for a clear shot at an officer, because he knew that killing a lieutenant caused more damage than killing 10 privates. Without leaders, enemy units became disorganized, made mistakes, and panicked. The first few weeks were devastating for the Soviets. Soldiers began dropping like flies, and no one knew where the shots were coming from. An officer would step out of his tent and simply collapse. A sergeant would be giving orders to his men, and suddenly his head would explode. A radio operator would establish communication, and the next person who tried to use the equipment would find the operator dead in his position. Fear began to spread like a virus through the Soviet lines. Soldiers stopped wanting to leave their trenches. Officers began to move only at night. Some even refused to wear their rank insignia so as not to be identified as high-value targets. But none of this mattered. Simo could identify an officer by his posture, by how he moved, by the way the other soldiers interacted with him. Stories about this invisible sniper began to grow legendary. Soviet soldiers started calling him Belaya Smrt, White Death. They said he was a ghost, that he couldn't be killed, that he could turn invisible in the snow. Political commissars tried to stop these rumors by executing soldiers for cowardice and defeatist propaganda. But the fear was real, tangible, unstoppable. The Soviet high command was furious. How could a single man be causing so much chaos? They sent in special counter-sniper teams, men specifically trained to hunt other snipers. They came with modern equipment, high-quality German telescopic sights, and years of professional training. He eliminated them all. One by one, these so-called experts ended up dead, victims of the very man they had come to hunt. Simo's technique for eliminating counter-snipers was particularly brutal. He knew these men would be actively searching for him, studying the terrain with their telescopic sights. So he used this against them. He positioned himself in impossible places, angles no military manual would consider. He fired from extreme distances where other snipers wouldn't even attempt the shot. And he always had an escape route planned before he pulled the trigger. A month passed. Then, too, Simo's death toll kept rising. 50 dead, 100 dead, 200 dead. The numbers were so high that even his superiors began to doubt. Was it really possible that a single man could have killed so many? But reports from other units confirmed the story. The Soviets were terrified of a phantom sniper who seemed to be everywhere at once. But the operation that would truly turn Simo Häyhä into a legend was yet to come. It was early January of 1940. The cold was more intense than ever, with temperatures reaching 45 degrees below zero. Finnish intelligence intercepted Soviet communications about a planned massive offensive to encircle Finnish positions in the Kala sector. The situation was critical. If the Soviets managed to execute that move, they would cut off Finnish supply lines and potentially capture hundreds of soldiers. But there was a problem. The Finnish forces didn't have enough men to stop that offensive. They were stretched to the limit, defending lines that were too long with too few troops. The Finnish command needed to do something desperate. And then someone suggested an idea that seemed straight out of a science fiction novel. Send Simo Häyhä behind enemy lines, alone, to cause as much chaos as possible and delay the offensive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It wasn't a plan. It was a death sentence. When Simo was presented with the mission, he didn't hesitate for a second. He didn't ask questions about the chances of survival. He didn't ask for guarantees or reinforcements. He simply nodded, checked his rifle, packed his ration of frozen black bread and some snow to melt like water, and disappeared into the darkness of the Arctic night. What happened in the next 72 hours would become the most extraordinary individual military feat of the entire Second World War. Simo infiltrated deep into Soviet territory, crawling for miles through the snow in complete darkness. The journey alone to reach his objective took him almost 12 hours, moving centimeters per minute to avoid being detected by enemy patrols. When he finally reached the Soviet rear lines, what he found was terrifying. A massive encampment with over 5,000 Red Army soldiers, dozens of tanks, artillery pieces, and all the logistical infrastructure for a major offensive. They were organized, confident, completely unprepared for what was coming. It was as if a lone wolf had wandered into a flock of sheep. Except these sheep had rifles and machine guns. Simo established his first position on a small rise, with a partial view of the camp. It was barely enough to see the officers' tents. And he waited. At dawn, when the first Soviet officer left his tent to urinate, probably thinking about the hot breakfast that awaited him, a bullet pierced his skull. He fell instantly, dead before he hit the ground. The camp erupted in activity. Soldiers rushed out of their tents, took up defensive positions, and fired into the shadows of the woods. But there was nothing to shoot. Simo had already moved to his second position, 400 meters to the east. 10 minutes later, another officer fell. Then a third. The Soviets were panicking, firing at anything that moved, accidentally killing each other in the confusion. Throughout that first day, Simo maintained a devastating psychological siege. He didn't fire constantly. That would have been a waste of ammunition and would eventually reveal his location. Instead, he fired selectively, strategically. One officer every hour, then silence. Then, just as the Soviets began to relax, thinking the sniper was gone, another shot. Another leader dead. Night fell, and the Soviets thought they could finally rest. But Simo wasn't sleeping. He moved closer to the camp, so close he could hear the soldiers' conversations. Now he had a different target, the generators that provided electricity to the camp. One well-placed shot, a minor explosion, and half the camp was plunged into darkness. In the ensuing chaos, he took out 3 more officers who rushed out to solve the problem. The second day was even worse for the Soviets. Now they were genuinely terrified. Nobody wanted to go out into the open. Officers refused to leave their shelters. Patrols sent to find the sniper simply vanished or returned empty-handed. It was like being hunted by something supernatural. The Soviet command made desperate decisions. They sent in a full team of elite counter-snipers, 12 men with top-of-the-line equipment and years of experience. Simo watched them from his position as they established their own locations around the camp's perimeter. He waited patiently until they felt secure, until they lowered their guard. And then he began eliminating them one by one. The first counter-sniper died without even knowing what hit him. He was watching the southern woods when a bullet came from the north. The second realized something was wrong and tried to reposition himself. Simo caught him on the move, an incredibly difficult shot that traveled over 500 meters. One after another, these so-called experts fell. Those who remained alive panicked and fled the area, refusing to try again. Frustrated and desperate, the Soviets resorted to extreme measures. If they couldn't find the sniper, they would destroy the entire forest. They brought in heavy artillery and began systematically bombarding every area where they thought he might be hiding. Hundreds of shells rained down on the forest, uprooting trees, creating massive craters, turning the landscape into a hell of fire and shrapnel. Simo buried himself in the snow as deep as he could, covered his head with his arms, and simply endured. Explosions shook the earth around him. The shock waves stole the air from his lungs. Metal fragments whizzed past his head, but he survived. When the bombing finally stopped and the Soviets sent patrols to confirm his death, Simo had already moved to a new position. And from there, he eliminated the patrol commander. By the third day, the Soviet situation was catastrophic. The offensive that should have started 2 days earlier was completely stalled. Nobody wanted to advance. The rank and file threatened mutiny if they were forced into the open. The surviving officers refused to give orders because they knew that would make them targets. Morale was completely destroyed, and Simo kept hunting. Now he had broadened his targets to include radio operators to cut off communications, mechanics trying to repair vehicles, and medics at first aid stations. Not because he was cruel, but because he understood that every critical role eliminated caused cascading effects on the enemy's operational capability. It was total war, psychological and physical. But even Simo had his limits. He hadn't really slept for 72 hours, barely eating snow and small pieces of frozen bread, exposed to lethal temperatures. His body was on the verge of physical collapse. He knew he couldn't continue much longer. He needed to retreat while he still had the strength to do so. On the night of the third day, as silently as he had arrived, Simo Häyhä began his extraction. He crept back through the Soviet lines, moving between patrols like a ghost. Several times he was within meters of enemy soldiers. Once, a Soviet soldier literally walked over him while he was buried in the snow. Simo remained completely still, holding his breath, his rifle ready in case he was discovered. But the soldier kept walking, unaware that the White Death was literally under his feet. 12 hours later, exhausted to the point of collapse, frozen to the bone, Simo finally crossed back into the Finnish lines. His comrades could hardly recognize him. He was covered in frozen snow, his face a white mask of frost, his movements robotic from extreme exhaustion. They immediately took him to a warm tent, gave him food and drink, and let him sleep for the first time in 3 days. When he woke up, his superiors wanted a detailed report. Simo simply said, "Mission accomplished." When asked how many he had eliminated, he had to think about it. He hadn't been keeping an accurate count during the chaos. He estimated more than 500. The officers thought he was exaggerating because of the trauma. But in the following days, when Finnish intelligence analyzed intercepted Soviet communications, enemy reports confirmed similar numbers. More important than the numbers was the strategic impact. The Soviet offensive never happened. It was postponed, reorganized, and eventually canceled because the assigned units were so demoralized that the commanders considered sending them into combat suicidal. A single man, with an old rifle and nothing but determination, had halted an offensive of 5,000 soldiers. But Simo Häyhä's war was far from over. That suicide mission was just one chapter in a much longer story. He would continue fighting throughout the Winter War, day after day, week after week, racking up a body count that defies belief. Military historians would eventually confirm more than 500 kills with his sniper rifle alone. If we include the casualties from his Suomi submachine gun in close combat, the number surpasses 700. What makes these figures even more impressive is the time frame. The Winter War lasted barely 100 days. That means Simo Häyhä averaged more than 5 confirmed kills per day, every day for more than 3 consecutive months under conditions that would kill most people within hours. It's a feat that no other sniper in history, before or since, has managed to match. The Soviets became obsessed with killing him. They offered massive rewards for information on his location. They sent team after team of elite snipers to hunt him down. They ordered targeted artillery bombardments of areas where they believed he operated. But Simo continued to survive, continued to hunt, continued to be the living nightmare of the Red Army. But even legends can bleed. On March 13, 1940, barely a week before the war ended, Simo was in his usual position when a Soviet sniper finally accomplished the impossible. He shot him directly in the face with an explosive bullet. The projectile completely shattered his lower left jaw, passed through his cheek, and destroyed several teeth. Half of his face simply disappeared in an explosion of blood and bone. Anyone else would have died instantly from that shot. Simo lost consciousness, but incredibly, his heart kept beating. His comrades found him hours later, unconscious, his face unrecognizable, lying in a pool of his own frozen blood. They dragged him back to the lines, certain he would die within minutes. The doctors who saw him said it was impossible for him to survive. The wound was too severe. But Simo Häyhä defied death once more. He slipped into a deep coma. The doctors did what they could, which wasn't much in a field hospital in the middle of a war. They didn't have the resources for complex reconstructive surgeries. They could only keep him stable and wait. Days passed, then a week. Simo remained unconscious, his body fighting a battle no doctor could help him fight. And then, on March 13, 1940, the very same day that Finland and the Soviet Union signed the peace treaty that ended the Winter War, Simo Häyhä opened his eyes. He awoke from his coma as if his body knew on some subconscious level that his work was done. His country was safe. He could rest now. The recovery was long and painful. It required more than 20 reconstructive surgeries to repair his face. He was permanently disfigured. The left half of his face would never be the same. But he survived. Against all medical odds, against all expectations, the man who had defied an entire army now defied death itself. When the war ended, Simo was promoted directly from corporal to second lieutenant by Marshal Mannerheim himself, an almost unprecedented honor. He became the most decorated soldier in Finnish history, but he never sought fame or recognition. In fact, he actively avoided public attention. After the war, Simo simply returned to his farm. He went back to the life he had lived before, cultivating the land, hunting occasionally, living in peace. When journalists or historians tried to interview him, he generally refused. When he occasionally agreed to speak, his answers were short, humble, almost uncomfortably modest for someone who had achieved what he had. They would ask him, "How did you become the greatest sniper in history?" His answer, "Practice." They would ask him, "How did it feel to kill so many men?" His answer, "I did what my country asked me to do." They would ask him, "Were you ever afraid?" His answer, "All the time." There was no bravado, no glorification of violence. Just a man who had done a horrible job because someone had to. Simo lived a long and quiet life after the war. He married, had no children, and continued hunting as a hobby into old age. He kept in touch with other Winter War veterans, occasionally attended memorial ceremonies, but mostly preferred the solitude of his farm and his woods. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, a journalist asked him how he felt seeing that the country that had invaded Finland no longer existed. Simo simply smiled, his face disfigured, and said, "Every empire eventually falls. Good people endure." On April 1, 2002, at the age of 96, Simo Häyhä passed away peacefully in a veteran's home. He had lived more than twice the average life expectancy of his generation, outliving not only the war that made him famous, but also nearly all of his contemporaries, allies and enemies alike. At his funeral, veterans from all over Finland came to pay their respects. The government honored him with a state ceremony. Flags flew at half-mast. And in the forests of Rotjärvi, where a farmer once became the deadliest force the world had ever seen, the snow fell silently as it always had. Today, more than 80 years after the Winter War, Simo Häyhä's legacy endures. His story is taught in military academies around the world. Modern sniper manuals study his techniques. Military psychologists analyze his ability to maintain his composure under extreme pressure. But more than that, he became a symbol of something deeper, the idea that courage, skill, and determination can overcome overwhelming advantages of numbers and resources. His story reminds us that in history's darkest moments, when all seems lost, extraordinary individuals can emerge from the most unexpected places. You don't need to be big, strong, or imposing. Simo was just a small, quiet, humble man. But when his country needed him, he became something more. He became a ghost, a legend, the White Death. And now, every time you look at a picture of a snowy forest, every time you see that endless white silence of winter, remember that once, in the middle of that seemingly empty landscape, a lone man with an antique rifle stopped an entire army. Remember that heroes don't always wear capes or shout grand pronouncements. Sometimes they are quiet farmers who simply do what needs to be done, regardless of the personal cost. Simo Häyhä's story also teaches us something about the nature of modern warfare. In an age where conflicts are increasingly decided by advanced technology, drones, satellite-guided missiles, and smart weapons, his story reminds us that the human factor remains critical. Technology can fail. Complex systems can collapse, but human will, determination, knowledge of the terrain, and individual skill can tip the scales when all else fails. The Soviet military learned this lesson the hard way. They had overwhelming numerical superiority. They had modern tanks, heavy artillery, and fighter jets. But they completely underestimated the power of soldiers fighting on their own terrain, who knew every inch of the forest, who would rather die than surrender. And they specifically underestimated what a single highly skilled and fully committed individual could accomplish. After the Winter War, militaries around the world studied what had happened in Finland. Tactical manuals were rewritten. Sniper training was revolutionized. Winter warfare tactics were completely redesigned. And at the heart of all these lessons was the story of a Finnish farmer who had become the Red Army's worst nightmare. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Simo's story is what it reveals about human psychology under extreme pressure. Military psychologists have studied his case extensively, trying to understand how someone could maintain the mental clarity necessary to make precision shots while freezing, starving, exhausted, and knowing that hundreds of people are actively trying to kill him. What they discovered was that Simo wasn't immune to fear or stress. In fact, he openly admitted that he was terrified most of the time. The difference was that he had developed, through years of hunting, the ability to function effectively even while experiencing extreme fear. He didn't eliminate the fear. He simply compartmentalized it, put it in a mental box, and continued doing his job. This ability to maintain executive function under extreme stress is what separates elite soldiers from ordinary ones. And Simo had honed it to a level few humans have reached. He could be shivering with cold, his stomach growling with hunger, hearing explosions all around him, and still make a perfectly calibrated shot from 500 meters away. His mind and body worked in perfect synchronicity even under the most hostile conditions imaginable. There's another dimension to his story that's often overlooked: the moral cost. Simo was a deeply religious man, raised in a traditional Lutheran community where human life was valued. Killing, for him, was not something he took lightly. Every shot he fired, he knew he was ending the life of someone who likely had family, friends, dreams. In one of the rare, extensive interviews he gave decades after the war, the journalist asked him if he was haunted by nightmares about the men he had killed. Simo answered honestly, "At first, yes, I saw their faces. I wondered who they were, what they had left behind. But then I remembered that they came to my country. They brought the war. I only defended my home. And the nightmares became more manageable." This moral rationalization wasn't denial or emotional coldness. It was how a fundamentally good man processed having done horrific things for necessary reasons. He never glorified what he had done. He never boasted about his kill count. In fact, when people tried to celebrate him as a hero, he was visibly uncomfortable. To him, it hadn't been heroism. It had been survival and duty. The paradox of Simo Häyhä is that he became the most efficient killer of his time precisely because he wasn't a killer by nature. He was a hunter, someone who killed to eat, not for glory or pleasure. That mindset gave him the patience and discipline that professional soldiers often lack. He had no ego to defend, no need to prove anything to anyone. He just needed to get the job done and go home. This lack of ego also explains why he rejected the modern equipment that other snipers coveted. It wasn't stubbornness or traditionalism. It was pure pragmatism. He knew that the best equipment for him was the equipment he knew intimately, not the equipment with the most impressive specifications on paper. While other snipers wasted time learning new weapons and optics, Simo used that time to perfect his skill with the rifle he had used for 20 years. This philosophy of mastery over novelty is relevant even today. In a world obsessed with the latest technology, with constantly upgrading to the newest model, Simo's story reminds us that sometimes the old and reliable outperform the new and flashy. Not because the old is inherently superior, but because complete mastery of a simple tool can be more effective than the competent use of a complex one. It's also worth considering the psychological impact Simo had on his enemies. It wasn't just the number of casualties he inflicted. It was the psychological terror. Soviet soldiers developed collective paranoia. They began to see ghosts in every shadow, to hear gunshots that never happened, to tremble with fear every time they had to go out into the open. This massive psychological trauma caused by a single individual is unique in military history. Soviet commanders tried to counter this with propaganda, telling their troops that the White Death was a myth, that it wasn't a single man but multiple Finnish snipers. But this only made things worse. If there were multiple phantom snipers, then the danger was everywhere. There was nowhere safe. The fear multiplied instead of diminishing. This multiplier psychological effect is something modern special forces study intensively. How can an individual or a small team cause a disproportionate impact not only through direct action, but also through psychological warfare? Simo Häyhä accidentally wrote the book on this subject. He didn't consciously plan it, but every decision he made maximized the psychological impact on the enemy. For example, their tactic of shooting officers first wasn't just strategically effective, it was psychologically devastating. Enlisted soldiers saw their leaders fall and realized that if their superiors weren't safe, they were completely defenseless. This created a sense of hopelessness that no amount of propaganda could counteract. Similarly, his practice of never firing twice from the same position meant the Soviets could never predict where he would be. Every tree, every snowdrift, every shadow could conceal death. This total unpredictability is perhaps the most effective form of psychological warfare. Fear of the known is manageable. Fear of the completely unpredictable is paralyzing. After the war, when military historians interviewed Soviet veterans of the Winter War, many admitted that the fear of Finnish snipers, and specifically the White Death, was worse than the cold, worse than hunger, worse than direct combat. You knew where the enemy trenches were. You could avoid known artillery positions, but snipers could be anywhere at any time and you wouldn't see them coming. This psychological advantage that Finland gained through snipers like Häyhä was crucial to their success in the Winter War. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they managed to inflict Soviet losses that Stalin had never anticipated. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree that for every Finn killed, between 5 and 8 Soviet soldiers died. These are extraordinary exchange rates for the defending side. And while it would be an exaggeration to attribute all this advantage to Simo Häyhä individually, there is no doubt that he and snipers like him played a disproportionate role in achieving these results. Their effectiveness forced the Soviets to change tactics, to move more cautiously, to waste time and resources searching for invisible threats. All of this gave the outnumbered Finnish forces the precious time they needed to organize effective defenses. There is a fascinating anecdote that illustrates Simo's impact on the Soviet collective consciousness. Years after the war, during the 1960s, a Soviet veteran who had fought in Finland wrote in his memoirs about the White Death. He described how his unit had lost 18 men in a single day to an invisible sniper. He wrote that not even the later German bombing raids in World War II had caused him the same level of terror, as he felt every time he had to go out into the open in those Finnish forests. This admission is revealing. This veteran had survived Stalingrad, one of the most brutal battles in human history. He had faced aerial bombardments, house-to-house fighting, extreme deprivation. But decades later, what haunted him most was the memory of a Finnish sniper he never saw, who possibly wasn't even Häyhä specifically, but who in his mind had merged with the myth of the White Death. This power of myth is fascinating in itself. Simo Häyhä, the man, was mortal, vulnerable, limited. But the White Death, the myth that grew up around him, became immortal. It became the personification of the Soviet fear of the Finnish forests. And that myth continued to be psychologically effective even after Simo was wounded and removed from the battlefield. In fact, the Finns cleverly never publicly confirmed during the war that the White Death was a single man, or even if he existed at all. They let the Soviets speculate, let them create their own terrifying theories. This deliberate ambiguity amplified the psychological effect. If you didn't know what was real and what was myth, everything became potentially real in your mind. This lesson about the power of ambiguity in psychological warfare has been applied repeatedly ever since by special forces around the world. It is not always advantageous for the enemy to know exactly what they are up against. Sometimes it is better to let them imagine something even more terrifying than reality. But beyond tactics and strategy, Simo Häyhä's story is also simply an extraordinary human story about perseverance. Let's consider for a moment what he actually accomplished. For more than 100 consecutive days, in temperatures that regularly reached 40 degrees below zero, with minimal rations, sleeping in frozen trenches when he could, this man got up every day and did the most dangerous job imaginable. There were no days off, no rotations away from the front lines, no therapists or counselors to help him process the trauma. There was only the next mission, the next objective, the next chance to die. And day after day, week after week, month after month, Simo just carried on. That's a kind of courage that goes beyond bravery in a moment of crisis. It's the unwavering determination to continue when every fiber of your being wants to give up. And finally, after all he had survived, he was struck by that devastating shot to the face. Even then, his body refused to give up. He was in a coma for days, his life hanging by the thinnest thread imaginable, and yet he survived. It's almost as if the sheer willpower he had developed over months of combat simply refused to let him die. When he finally awoke and began his long recovery, Simo had to face a different but equally challenging reality. His face was permanently disfigured. His military career was over. The war that had defined his existence for months was over. He had to find a way to become a civilian again, to go back to being just Simo the farmer after having been the White Death. Many veterans struggle with this transition. Some never truly make it, haunted by their experiences, unable to adjust to normal life after having experienced the extremes of human existence. But Simo, with the same quiet determination he had shown on the battlefield, simply returned to his farm and rebuilt his life. He didn't seek fame. He didn't write sensationalist books. He didn't give lectures. He didn't try to capitalize on his status as a national hero. He simply lived quietly and modestly as he had lived before the war. This genuine humility, this absence of ego, is perhaps the most admirable characteristic of all. In an age where fame is desperately sought, where people will do anything for attention, Simo Häyhä actively avoided the spotlight. And so he lived for 60 more years after the war. 60 years of quiet life, of honest work, of enjoying the simple things he had so fiercely defended. The freedom of his country, the peace of its forests, the company of friends and family. In a sense, his long, peaceful life was the best revenge against those who had tried to take it from him. He survived, he prospered, and he died on his own terms. Today in Finland, Simo Häyhä is remembered as a national hero, but not the kind who glorifies war. He is remembered as the man who did the impossible to defend his home, who paid a terrible price for it, but who never lost his essential humanity. In his hometown, there is a small, unassuming memorial as humble as the man himself. There are no grandiose statues or imposing monuments, just a simple reminder that once upon a time, when necessary, ordinary people did extraordinary things, and that, perhaps, is the final lesson of Simo Häyhä's story. You don't need to be special from birth to do incredible things. You don't need to be genetically superior or have supernatural gifts. Simo was an ordinary farmer who happened to be exceptional at something specific because he had practiced it his whole life. And when his country needed him, he used that skill to defend what he loved. Each of us has skills, talents, and abilities that we've developed through years of practice and passion. And while we hope we never need to use them in circumstances as extreme as Simo's, his story reminds us that the potential for greatness exists in unexpected places. It exists in the quiet farmer, the humble worker, the ordinary person who does their job day after day without seeking recognition. Because in the end, that's what Simo Häyhä was. Not a super soldier. Not a ruthless killer. Not a movie hero with an epic soundtrack. Just a man who loved his land, who had a specific skill, and who, when the time came, did what he had to do regardless of the personal cost. And that's why, because of that essential humanity combined with extraordinary skill and unwavering courage, his story endures. More than 80 years later, in a world entirely different from the one he knew, we continue to tell his story. We continue to marvel at his accomplishments. We continue to try to understand how one man could achieve what he did. And we continue to learn from his example that true greatness comes not from seeking glory, but from doing your duty with excellence, even when no one is watching, even when the cost is terrible, even when it would be so much easier to give up. This was the story of Simo Häyhä, the farmer who became the deadliest sniper in history, the man who faced an entire army and won, the warrior who never lost his soul, the White Death who, in the end, only wanted to live in peace. May his memory always remind us that true heroes walk among us, often unbeknownst to us, until the time comes when the world needs them to rise up.